Welcome to the Bernina 880 Mastery Live. This is our Lesson 4, More Stitches with Stitch Designer with Susan Fears.
Thanks, Catherine, and welcome everyone. This is a great lesson to learn about Stitch Designer. So we've spent some time working with stitches in the 9mm mode and the larger sideways motion stitches. We've worked in combination and we've worked with a lot of creative functions that allow us to create some pretty unique situations for our projects. So those were all built-in things, and today we're going to focus on the Stitch Designer. This is something that allows you to create your own stitches. So we're going to look at the tools that allow you to do this. You're going to learn how to click with design by clicking or by drawing freehand. So we can click points to create a design, or we can draw freehand. You also can edit existing stitches, so you don't always have to start from scratch. Then we'll talk about how to save and retrieve these to and from the machine, and how to work with the USB stick, because the stitches can go places. You can swap them with your friends who have 880s, or maybe you want to take them into the Bernina Embroidery Software, or maybe you want to bring stitches from the Bernina Embroidery Software over to the 880 to stitch out. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but let's get started with the Stitch Designer. So if you were wondering what that one icon on the main screen that we haven't really addressed was all about, has the little pencil, that is your Stitch Designer icon. When you open the screen, you have a highlighted area in the middle, and you can see that denoted with the little yellow bar that I've drawn. That is your 9mm area for drawing stitches. And when the little 9mm icon is locked or highlighted, then whenever you draw, you're not going to be able to go beyond that highlighted area. If you turn that off, then you can draw very wide, and you can create a lot of sideways motions. Some of the tools, we're going to just step through them in little chunks. When you open the Stitch Designer program, it will default to the pencil tool, so you'll always have the drawing tool selected. Right above that is move, because you have the ability to select a point and move it. And then you may need to pan the screen or move the view of the screen so that you can see more of your stitch. And we're going to experiment with all of these tools today. Below that you have scrolling, and so with the design on screen, which is a Stitch Designer stitch, there are 18 needle points in this stitch, and I'm at the last one, or that's where my cursor currently is. There are arrows that can take you forward and backward through the stitch should you need to move or alter, or to copy or isolate an area. Below that is selection, and on the selection icon there's a little triangle in the corner which lets you know that it'll fan out to show you additional options. So you can select everything on the screen, you can select some, and then you have a current selection, which is a single point. Some of the tools that you also have to work with, some you may recognize in the list over there, but there is new. So when you want to clear the page for new drawing or to design a new stitch, you can select the new icon. Below that is mirror image, and we've seen that in other functions, and it works the same way here. You can, most of the time when you're drawing, or when you are drawing, the default is single stitch mode. But you may draw and decide you'd rather have a more emphasized stitch, and you could turn on triple stitch. The play button is very exciting, and that's a great way to see how the stitch is going to sew just by playing it on screen. And this is great if you have maybe a complicated stitch, something with a lot of needle points, and you just want to see where the needle's going. Maybe you can't tell a part of the stitch that you'd like to get a little bit better idea, but this will help you see what it's going to stitch out like before you go to your fabric. Then there is snap to grid. So while you can just draw anywhere on the screen, sometimes you want to be a little bit more precise, and snap to grid can come in really handy. Isolating your pinpoints will lock to the grid points on the screen. Moving over, you'll see the trash can, and as in previous function, that indicates delete. Then you see the other mirror image. Duplicate is the same icon that you'll see in embroidery when we address that section. And then you have invert, and this is easier to explain when you see it. So when we get to invert, you'll understand what that does. But basically what the picture is showing you of the icon is exactly what it does. It takes a design and just flips it. Moving to the other side of the screen, you have undo and redo, and there are 20 levels of undo. So that's a fantastic way to operate, because every now and then you're going to select something, or something's going to happen that you didn't like, and it's very easy just to undo that mark. And then you have levels of zoom, and this is helpful when especially if you are designing a sideways motion stitch and you need to have a smaller screen because you're planning to draw something kind of big, and we'll look at this too. So just a few facts about Stitch Designer. I've already mentioned there are 20 levels of undo. It's very exciting to have an undo feature in the Stitch Designer screen. Created stitches, or stitches that you design, are limited to 2,000 stitches. There is no width limitation when you're designing wider than 9 millimeters, so you can really start thinking of some very large pieces. And then when you are designing in Stitch Designer, you're going to select the green OK, the green check, and you'll sew from the sewing screen. So that's where you always want to stitch from. You can, of course, save things that you designed to Personal Program, and we'll work with that too. So what we're going to do is a series of exercises, and there's a lot of exercises that we're going to look at that are going to just show you the different ways to work with Stitch Designer that help you know how the tools work. In some exercises we'll repeat the usage of tools that we've used before with the hopes that you will help learn the tools a little bit easier. So our little daisy that we're going to draw, that's basic freehand drawing. Then next to that is a stitch where that's just clicking some points. Then there's another clicking points, but clicking to form more of a shape, and we'll use invert and talk about some of the intricacies of this piece. Then we're going to look at a couple of stitches and we're going to edit them. And that's a great way to supplement stitches that you already have without having to start from scratch. And then we're going to take a look at a wider than 9 millimeter stitch. So that if you look at the presser foot on the right hand side of the screen, you're going to notice that the stitch extends beyond that 9 millimeter opening. So we're going to look at how to design this type of stitch. So we're going to go to our simulator and take a look at how this all takes place. So this is our Stitch Designer icon. Select it. It always brings in the stitch that was on the screen that you started with. To get rid of this, you just touch the new, and now you're ready. You have a blank page. You're ready to start drawing. And the pencil is your default tool, so you are ready to draw. So you could just scribble if you wanted to. And again, you could undo one, the whole thing was selected, so it just undid everything. Took me back to my straight stitch. You could add to this if you wanted to. But what I want to do is just do a little freehand drawing. And I'm going to start by just drawing a little daisy. And that's what my stitch looks like. Now if you look at the grid is, the highlight area is 9 millimeters. And I'm only using about 4 millimeters. So this is a very, very tiny stitch. And probably why it looks so crunched up. So this is very easy to freehand draw. You take your fingertip or your stylus and you just draw on screen. And then when you're ready to stitch this out, you press the check and there is your stitch. You may or may not like this, but you could go back and you can edit it, which we're going to do with some other things. You may decide, well, I didn't really use the full 9 millimeters, so let me try that a little bit differently. See if I can get a better stitch, and perhaps you like this better. But with freehand drawing, this is what you're doing. You're just sort of drawing on screen. Now another way to draw is just by clicking points. So you can just start clicking points randomly to create a stitch. But let's create something that you actually might want to stitch out. So we're going to turn on the snap to grid, and we're going to create, just by tapping some points on our grid, some So having the snap to grid turned on is really helping me. I don't have to be so precise with my pinpoints because where I touch the screen is it's going to move to the closest grid point. So as I'm drawing, you'll see the stitch form over here. This is the end point, and so for it to start stitching again, it would end up back down here, back to its needle point. So at this point, I have half of this stitch design. We're going to go to our selection tool and select everything. Then I want to duplicate that and mirror image side to side. And I'm kind of watching what's going on in the preview screen while this is going on. And you want to get in the habit of that, because that's what's really going to help you see the overall image of the stitch and will help you know what you want to do next. Now, what is selected is the blue area. So while this is still selected, I'm going to select Move. And I can use my stitch length knobs to move it. Maybe that looks better, or maybe I want to move it so that it's going to overlap. With Snap to Grid active, it doesn't really want to continue doing much. So I'm going to now move it by turning Snap to Grid off, and so I can get exactly the look that I am looking for. And I like this. I think this is a really neat look for clicking points and designing a stitch. So let's play this back and see what it looks like if it were to stitch out. So here's what our needle is going to do. And now it's ready to start the next stitch. If you like this and you want to sew it out, you won't sew from here. You want to select the green check, and this is the screen you'll always stitch from. To save this, because you like what you've drawn, you'll select Personal Program. You'll select the folder with the arrow going into it, and there's only one of those for Save. Select the folder that you want to save something to, and select the highlighted stitch, and now it is saved away. So you could put that into a combination if you wanted to. You could, save it away for another day. So let's go back and take a look at some other things that we want to do with our stitches. So we'll go into our Stitch Designer, and actually we're going to go back out of Stitch Designer, and I'm going to select a stitch. So I'm going to select a stitch from our 700 menu, and I can scroll and look for that. It's actually stitch number 736. When I go into the Stitch Designer screen, the stitch comes with me. It's a 9mm stitch, so I have the full use of the highlighted area. And now I want to change this. Right now my cursor is here. This is where the last and the current stitch point is. I'm in single stitch point selection mode, and I want to move, and I want to alter this a little bit. I want to change this. So Move is selected, and I'm going to use the arrow keys, and I'm going to advance backwards through the design. And I'm going to set my cursor to the point before the place I want to insert my next needle point. So to insert, you want to select Draw, and then you come and touch on the screen, and now I've added a point. I want to move this away. So in order to move, you want to turn the Move function back on, and now when you touch the stitch, you're able to move it into the position that you want. My cursor is now here, and I could continue to move it throughout the stitch. You want to remember that just like when we worked with combination, anytime you insert a stitch or a needle point, in this case, it always happens in front of the cursor. So I moved through using the arrows, going to select my stitch or my draw pin, add my stitch, select Move, and I can drag it, or I can use the knobs to move it. So you have a couple of different ways that you can move things. There's another way to move the point along without using the arrows, and if this were a fairly complicated stitch, using these arrows could be a little tedious. Move is already selected, so to select a point, select Move, and touch on the area that you want to move to. Select the pencil, tap in the point that you need, select Move, and this time you'd have to use the stitch length knob to move the point inward. So now we have created our altered stitch. You select Check, and this is what would stitch out. And again, this is a stitch that you can save into your memory for later use, or for use to maybe to put into a combination. I want to go back to drawing another stitch. So I'm going to clear the screen, and there's another way that you might want to tap to add some points. So I have my pencil selected, and this line in the middle It's a little bit darker, just vaguely, than the other grid lines that you have. This is center needle position. We're going to draw a heart, and we're going to tap in just points making this rounded curve. And you can see what's happening on my screen as I'm doing this. And this is half the heart. Now for the other side of the heart, I don't want to draw it. I just want to copy this. I want to duplicate and get the other half. So we need to select everything that's on the screen. Then we want to duplicate. And what it's done is it has created my duplication below where my last stitch point was. Then I want to mirror image it side to side. And the next thing you want to select is invert. And what invert is going to do is just bring invert the start and end points. So now I have the heart, but you can't see all of it. So this is when pan comes in pretty handy. You select the hand and you can touch the screen, and now you can look at it. So let's look at this stitch and talk about what's really going on here. I have a heart. In my preview screen, there's only one heart. So what does this mean exactly? Let's play it and see. So it's going to stitch, and it started where we started drawing, and now it's going to go back. So the start and the end point are exactly the same space. What would happen here is that the heart is going to stitch over top of itself over and over and over. There is nothing to advance the heart to continue on. So what can we do how would this design even be useful? Well, let's think about that. The heart we have built into the machine has some travel stitches. There is no heart that is a separate stitch by itself. So yes, let's say you want to just put some isolated hearts with no other stitches around it onto a project. So you have that. You could stitch one of these and just scatter stitches on a project. You could also take this into embroidery and do the same thing. As a sewing stitch, if you wanted to stitch a whole line of hearts, then you need to add some additional stitches. So right now, the last point is here. We're going to go back to my selection and select single point. We want to select draw, and now I'm going to figure out a way to advance the stitch throughout the heart so that I can get the start point down to this end tip point. So I've just drawn one side of the heart to have another echo. And you can see now on the preview side that the needle point has been advanced so that now the hearts do not stitch on top of each other. So now you're probably thinking, well, okay, great, but wouldn't it be kind of cool if this one and the other one were alternating? So let's design the rest of it. Let's select selection, select all. Let's select duplicate. Here's our heart. And now let's do mirror image. And now we have that change of design on both sides. So now we can check. And this is how our stitch would stitch out. So it's going to advance. So this is just another way to think about approaching Stitch Designer. Now we have used almost all of the tools within the Stitch Designer except for this middle section here. So let's talk about when you might want to use that. And to do that, I'm going to go back out and we're going to select a stitch that already exists, and it's stitch number 112. We'll go into Stitch Designer, and this stitch comes with me. So let's scroll out just a little bit so we can see a little bit about what's going on. The end point of the stitch is here. So we use selection, and we're going to tell it, I just want to select some. You'll notice the end point now has a little blue circle around it. When you use the arrow keys to scroll back up, anything that you select is now turning blue or becoming active. So this is how you select some of the design. So now that I have what I need selected, you want to duplicate, and let's mirror image top to bottom. So now I'm changing this stitch to do something different. And I like everything that's going on except for this stitch right here where it's joining up back to the beginning. So this is an opportunity again. Let's look at moving the hand. Right now what we have selected is select some. If I tapped on the design at this point, it would select, sorry, I need to have move. It would select everything from where the stitch was to what I selected. So that's another way to select. But really what I want is to select a single point, and I want that single point to be this point up here. So we'll select move and we'll just tap that point. You can then move this, and while this is moving, you really want to focus on what's going on here. And if I pan again, I notice that this ends on this axis line. So that's really kind of where I want that first vine to start, and that's going to give me a nice fluid stitch. So we'll pan back up, and I really need for this point to move to this axis somehow. So using move, well, we'll just move it there. And then we'll start to move other points to get you the look and the look of the line that you need. If you need to add a point, then select the pencil, add a point, and that's going to give you another stitch point that you can now move around and give it a little fluidness or a little curve. So still with move selected, just sort of moving these points along until you find something that looks good to your eye. You may decide you want another point. Sorry, select the pencil, select move and another point, and we're just about there. But we have, and you can see how this could really be something you play with for a long time. Let's use our zoom to see more of the stitch, and this is what we have going on. This is what the independent stitch is going to look like. So we're going to check to confirm this is what we want to stitch out. And I also want to save this to my personal program. But I also think this is a great stitch that I want to share with somebody. So I'm going to show you how to save this to a USB stick. So let's go to our heart. Right now I'm going to save to the machine, so I select the folder going in. I usually keep all of my saved stitches, my Stitch Designer stitches, in one folder. I usually keep them in folder number 4. So these are some of the things that I designed, and you'll recognize some of them. So let's just add it to folder number 4. You may have noticed also that when we were in Save, when you're in the transition or the widescreen view, you have the USB option. And this is the only time you'll see the USB option, is if you're in the larger view of the screen, so with the transition. So how to get there, if you're back at your heart, you want to select the transition and then your save, and now you have the USB option. So you would select the USB option and you would then touch the highlighted stitch to save it. So that's how you save something to a USB stick, and now it can go other places. So you could take it with you to class. If you design something in class that you want to take home, you could save it to your USB stick and then carry it home to your home machine to stitch it out. Or maybe you're having an 880 Stitch Designer swap party and you want to swap stitches with your friends. So this is a great chance to do that. Let's look at designing one other thing, and that would be something large. So let's go back into our Stitch Designer, and we're going to turn the 9mm lock off. Actually, I'm going to turn it back on, and I'm going to bring us back to our larger view, our full view, and we're going to get a new screen. Now if I turn the lock off, this is pretty close to the 9mm view. You want to scroll down or zoom down to about 5 levels. And your pencil is selected, and I'm going to start just drawing some circles. And I'm kind of thinking about, if I were doing this as a continuous quilting design, what would that look like? So I'm just drawing some little pebbles, and I want to end kind of close to this starting axis, and I haven't done that. So I've got this little bubble in the preview window. So this is when you get to do a little editing. So we want to select single point, and I'm going to select the move function because some of this could be adjusted just by moving some of the points. This point is way off, so let's select some of these, and then maybe even as you get them to where they're smoother, you may not like that there's a gap there. So let's minimize the gap, and that's when the trash can comes in pretty handy. I still have a jagged edge, so I need to decide which point needs to be the one that gets fixed to eliminate that jagged point. And as I see what I've got going on here, I probably need to move this one so that it's a little bit more in alignment with the other. So that is one way, and you could continue to move that stitch or just get rid of it altogether until you have something that's a little bit more pleasing. If you don't like the gap here, we just sort of move it. So we can tighten this up a little bit so that it hugs that area a little bit better. And now you have maybe a more fluid looking stitch. Now when I select the checkbox here, you'll notice the stitch goes beyond your 9mm foot, and your stitch your presser foot recommendation is 40C, which is your sideways motion foot. So the machine is really smart to help you sew in the right situation. So that is designing a large stitch. Now one thing I want to show you is something way, way cool. But I'm going to go back and forth to our PowerPoint for just a minute. So we just designed this stitch or something similar. Your 9mm lock was off. We zoomed out for more drawing space, and we zoomed out about 5 times. Think about if this were a continuous line. Trying to start and stop on the same y-axis will really help you. And then have fun with this. You can also bring in a sideways motion stitch that already exists on the machine and edit that as well. So we talked a little bit about swapping stitches. We've already copied a stitch to the USB stick. So another place I can take that stitch to the from the machine is I can take it into the Embroidery Software 7. If I can take stitches in there, I can certainly bring stitches from the software into the Bernina 880. So there are stitches that exist in the Bernina software that do not exist on the machine. One of those stitches is candlewicking. There's also blackwork stitches, so you wouldn't have to design those. You would just need to copy them out of the, you would need to open a stitch on this on the software screen and then export it to your USB stick and then open it into your 880, and I'm going to show you how that's done. There is a tutorial on the Bernina YouTube channel which does show you some of this with another technique, so don't forget to look at some of the tutorials on our YouTube channel for additional information. So going back to the machine, I have a candlewicking stitch on my USB stick. So to get that, you're going to select the arrow coming out of the folder, but I see no USB stick option here. Again, you need to select the expanded view, select your USB stick, and this is the candlewicking stitch. So I'm going to select the candlewicking stitch, and this is it on the sewing screen. I could sew it here right now, but when we look at the Stitch Designer, you're going to see if you sew it here, you're only going to sew one. You're not going to sew any more than that. So if we go to the Stitch Designer screen, I see that my stitch is right there. If I watch it play, it starts in the center, and you can see how the stitch is formed. Okay. It started in the center and it ended in the center, which is the same problem as the heart that we designed had. It started and stopped in the same place, meaning you're just going to have a stitch over top of itself over and over and over. So what we need to do to use this as a sewing stitch is to add some traveling stitches through the design so that we can advance the needle to the next position. So you'll want to turn on your pencil. You could use Snap to Grid if you want. That would help you eliminate having any stitches that aren't straight. And as you start adding these stitches to advance out of the center, you notice you get more candlewicking dots. That's pretty close together. Each of these dots and each of the grid lines that you see when we're in the other view is 1 millimeter. So this is still pretty tiny. So you probably want to add enough to move to the next spot, and then you would check. You could sew from here. This stitch you would want to stitch with foot number 20C or something with a tunnel on the underneath side to allow that buildup of thread to pass underneath the foot easily, just like we did with our compact satin stitches when we were talking about sewing those easily. I wouldn't use the thickest thread that I have because this is going to be fairly thick, but you also could use this as a stitch into embroidery and scatter this around embroidery. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with this, bringing this into the Bernina 880. Now another thing that you can do if you have software or if you're thinking about software is we've already worked with the Candlewicking Stitch, is to draw in the embroidery software. So on the screen, if I draw horizontally, it's going to be a sideways motion stitch. If I want it to stitch forward, then I'm going to be writing sideways. Or you could also use the multi-directional and change it up. But using the embroidery software, I can use the open freehand tool and I can write my name. Then I can resize it to the size I want just by using the height and width. Just type in the number that you want. And then if you want it to stitch out and with the, going with the foot, then just rotate it those 45 degrees. I'm sorry, 90 degrees. You'll select rotate twice. Then you want to write to machine. So you'll select the write to machine option, select the USB stick, and now when you open this with the USB stick option, you select what you've drawn, bring it to your screen, and now you're able to stitch that out. So there's a lot of different ways that the two can work together to where you can make it very easy on yourself. And it's a great way to have the best of both worlds. Designing stitches on the Bernina 880, you can take them into the Bernina software to create pattern outlines with them, to create different shapes with them. You can design in the embroidery software things that may be easier to design, maybe on a larger screen, or things that are easier to do horizontally on the computer screen, and then bring them over. So they can go both ways. It's really kind of fun. If you want to have a little fun practicing on paper before you go to your machine, there is an included grid file to let you do some doodling and let you do some drawing, and maybe help you plot your grid points before you go to your screen. And of course you can use the Bernina software as well. So there are exercises with your handout that accompany this lesson that will step you through the exercises that we have done, and some of the ones in the software should you want to try that sometime. So thank you for joining us for more stitches with the Stitch Designer. It's an amazing function to have on our Bernina 880s. And the next time we get together, we'll be talking about, I've titled the lesson Smooth Operators, and these are things that make our sewing go much smoother, such as automatic buttonhole feet, the Bernina stitch regulator for free motion quilting or free motion doodling, the Bernina dual feed. We'll talk about what's that all about, and there's a few more topics that we'll address in Smooth Operators. So I look forward to us working together on that lesson next time we're meeting. Thanks.